He thought he was just repairing an old sofa, but what he found inside turned his whole life upside down and forced him to call the police immediately. No one expected that such a thing could be hidden in ordinary furniture. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The air in Indiana carried that faint autumn heaviness, even though the sun still threw its light generously over the small town. Michael Reynolds stepped out of his pickup truck and looked at the house that had once belonged to his late uncle. It stood there at the end of a quiet street, paint fading on the wooden siding, roof shingles curling after years of neglect. The front porch sagged a little on one side, and the railing had long since lost its battle against rot. Still, there was something about the house that stirred a sense of belonging in him. Maybe it was because he remembered coming here as a boy, when summers seemed longer and his uncle's gruff voice filled the kitchen with laughter. Now, though, the man was gone, and the house had been left to Michael, a man just past 40 who had spent the last year stumbling through the wreckage of his divorce. He had signed the papers only 3 months earlier, giving his ex-wife the house they had shared in Indianapolis. Their 2 kids lived with her, though he saw them every other weekend if schedules allowed. He missed them with an ache that didn't ease no matter how many hours he threw into work at the garage. His job as an auto mechanic kept his hands busy, but it couldn't quiet his thoughts when he lay awake in the small rented apartment where he had been staying. When the lawyer called about the inheritance, Michael knew it was the universe nudging him toward something different. A place to start fresh, away from the familiar roads and painful memories of the city. He walked up the creaking steps and unlocked the door. The scent hit him immediately. Dust, mothballs, and that unmistakable musty odor of wood that has absorbed years of silence. He paused in the entryway, letting his eyes adjust to the dim interior. His uncle hadn't been a man of taste, but he had been practical. The furniture was heavy, functional, and old-fashioned. Dark wood tables with scratches from decades of use, a tall grandfather clock that no longer ticked, shelves stacked with worn paperbacks and framed photographs of people long gone. And then there was the sofa. It sat in the center of the living room, beneath a big window that looked out onto the street. The fabric, once green, had faded into a sickly brownish color. In some spots, the threads had torn, exposing the stuffing beneath. The wooden legs were scuffed, the arms sagged, and when Michael pressed a hand down on the cushion, it gave a faint groan of springs protesting after years of weight. It was ugly, he thought at first, and he considered dragging it out to the curb and letting the sanitation crew deal with it. Yet, as he stood there, staring at the bulky piece of furniture, something inside him shifted. He remembered being 8 years old, sitting on that very sofa with his legs barely reaching the edge, while his uncle poured them both glasses of soda and switched on a football game. He remembered falling asleep on it during Thanksgiving dinners, curled up under a heavy quilt while voices murmured in the kitchen. That sofa wasn't just an object. It was a fragment of his childhood, a piece of his uncle's life that had now fallen into his hands. Michael sat down, the springs creaking under his weight. The fabric smelled faintly of dust and time, but it also carried with it something grounding, something steady. He leaned back and closed his eyes. For the first time in months, he felt an odd sense of calm, as if this broken, battered house and its tired old furniture could somehow give him a chance at rebuilding himself. The divorce had stripped him bare. He had lost his marriage, the comfort of his children's daily presence, and the place he had once called home. Here, with this sofa, he could try again. The thought of restoration came to him suddenly, but it stuck. He would fix it. He had always been good with his hands. Cars, engines, carpentry. He wasn't afraid of work. Why not bring this sofa back to life? Why not take something neglected, something others might toss aside, and prove it still had value? He smiled faintly at the idea. Restoring the sofa would be more than just a project. It would be a metaphor, though he would never say it out loud. It would be his way of showing himself that broken things weren't always beyond repair. He got up and walked around the room, making mental notes of everything that needed attention. The floorboards needed sanding, the windows replacing. The kitchen cupboards were warped, and the bathroom faucet dripped steadily. But all of that could wait. The sofa would be first. It was right there in the middle of the house, the centerpiece, and tackling it would give him momentum. He imagined how it might look with new fabric, perhaps a sturdy leather or a warm plaid. He imagined sitting on it with his kids when they came to visit, watching movies together, making this old house feel like a home again. That evening, he unpacked his few belongings, setting a duffel bag in the upstairs bedroom and plugging in his phone charger by the wall. The house was quiet, almost oppressively so, and every creak made him aware of how alone he was. But when he returned to the living room, his eyes fell on the sofa again, and the silence seemed less heavy. He turned on the single lamp in the corner, bathing the room in a soft yellow glow, and sat down once more. The cushions sagged, the springs protested, but he stayed there for a long time, thinking. He thought about his uncle, about the way the man had lived, alone, reclusive, not much loved by the neighbors. He thought about how quickly life could unravel. One day, you're alive, stubborn and gruff, and the next day, you're gone, leaving behind a house full of echoes and a sofa full of memories. Michael didn't want to end up that way. He wanted this house to be more than a mausoleum of someone else's life. He wanted it to be his own. Before bed, he searched online for upholstery shops in town, making a list of supplies he might need. Staple gun, new fabric, heavy-duty thread, maybe even replacement springs. He felt a flicker of excitement he hadn't felt in a long while. For months, his life had been nothing but paperwork, arguments, and quiet despair. Now, finally, he had something to pour himself into. That night, he lay in the narrow bed upstairs, listening to the wind press against the windows. The house made noises, groans, pops, whispers in the wood, but instead of unnerving him, they felt almost like company. He drifted off to sleep with the image of the sofa in his mind, already imagining how it would look once he had given it new life. Morning came with pale light filtering through thin curtains. Michael brewed coffee in the old machine he found in the kitchen, its sputtering cough filling the room with the smell of burnt grounds. He carried a mug to the living room and stood before the sofa, studying it with the eye of a man preparing for a challenge. It was ugly, tired, broken, but it was his. The plan was clear now. He would strip it down to the frame, clean it, repair what he could, and rebuild it piece by piece. He didn't know what the end result would be, but he knew the process would matter as much as the outcome. The house, the sofa, his life, they all needed restoration, and he was ready to begin. As he set down the coffee cup and knelt beside the armrest to examine the seams, he had no idea what the project would eventually reveal. To him, in that quiet morning, it was only about fabric and nails, wood and stitches. He could not yet know that buried within the worn cushions and torn lining lay secrets far darker than dust and springs, secrets that would shake the fragile calm he had just begun to build. For now, though, It was just a man, a house, and an old sofa waiting for a second chance. The following morning broke with a steady drizzle tapping against the windows of the old house, the kind of rain that blurred the line between hours and gave the day a muted, heavy tone. Michael stood in the living room, coffee cup in hand, studying the sofa as though it were an opponent he needed to understand before making the first move. The previous night's certainty still lingered in him. This project would be his fresh start, the proof that he could take something ruined and make it whole again. He set the mug aside, rolled up the sleeves of his flannel shirt, and crouched down with a kind of cautious determination. The sofa greeted him with its familiar odor of mildew and dust, a smell that seemed almost baked into the fibers. He tugged at one of the armrests and felt the wood beneath the fabric shift slightly. Years of weight had warped it, but the frame still held. That gave him hope. He fetched the small toolkit he had brought from his truck and laid out pliers, a hammer, and a box of nails on the floor beside him. Working carefully, he began removing the tarnished brass tacks that lined the edges of the fabric. Each tack came loose with a metallic squeal, sending a puff of dust into the air. He coughed, waved his hand in front of his face, and kept going, driven by something deeper than simple curiosity. As he peeled back the first section of fabric, he was struck by the hidden world inside the sofa. Layers of cotton batting had yellowed with age, packed unevenly around rusted springs. He had expected decay, maybe even a mouse nest or two, but what he saw was a testament to how long the sofa had endured. He pulled away more of the covering, exposing the skeleton of the piece. It was hard work. His knuckles scraped against rough wood, and the stale odor of decades filled his lungs, but it felt rewarding in a way that surprised him. The hours slipped by unnoticed. Outside, the rain persisted, tapping its rhythm against the roof, while inside, the house echoed with the sounds of staples being pried out, fabric tearing and wood groaning as it was freed from its prison of cloth. Michael lost himself in the rhythm. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about the empty apartment he had left behind, the bitter arguments with his ex-wife, or the way his children's laughter now felt like something he had to borrow rather than own. All of that dissolved under the simple, physical demand of the work. At one point, he paused to straighten his back and flex his stiff fingers. That was when he noticed something odd. Along the upper edge of the sofa's backrest, beneath a section of particularly thick padding, there was a hard object that didn't belong. He frowned, assuming it might be part of the frame or a clump of hardened glue. He pulled the fabric farther apart, prying at the padding with the end of his screwdriver, and that was when he saw the glint of metal. It was small, barely larger than a pack of matches, wedged tightly between the padding and the wooden slat. At first glance, it looked like a piece of hardware, maybe an old hinge, but as he worked it free, brushing away dust with his fingers, he realized it was something else entirely. A lens stared back at him, dark and unblinking, surrounded by a square casing of black plastic. His breath caught in his throat. He turned it in his hands, and a tiny light blinked once, red and insistent, before fading again. A camera. Michael sat back on his heels, the object heavy in his hand despite its small size. He turned it over, tracing the wires that had been carefully hidden inside the padding, feeding towards the lower part of the sofa. His mind raced. Why would there be a camera inside a sofa? His first thought was that maybe his uncle had installed it, though that idea seemed absurd. The old man had never even owned a smartphone. He was the kind of person who still balanced his checkbook by hand and called the bank for his account balance. Surveillance equipment didn't fit into that picture. The more he studied it, the clearer it became that this wasn't some outdated relic. The casing was modern, sleek, the kind of design you'd expect from a piece of consumer technology no more than a few years old. The tiny indicator light told him it wasn't just a dead relic. It was functional. A prickling sensation crawled over his skin as he set it down on the coffee table. For a long moment, he simply sat in silence, the sound of the rain filling the room. The camera lay there like an accusation, an object that didn't belong in the narrative he had written for himself about restoration and fresh starts. He thought of his uncle again, of the man's solitary life in this house, and wondered if there had been things he never knew. Neighbors had always said the old man kept to himself, that he was private, maybe too private. Was this why? Michael forced himself to keep working, though his thoughts were distracted now, circling around the strange discovery. As he peeled back more layers of fabric from the opposite side of the sofa, his screwdriver scraped against something else metallic. His pulse quickened. He reached inside, fingers brushing over wires again. This time, when he pulled the object free, it wasn't a camera, but a small rectangular device with buttons and a tiny display. A recorder. It took him a second to recognize it, but the weight of it in his palm and the scuffs on its casing told him it had been hidden for some time. He thumbed the switch out of instinct, and, to his disbelief, a faint green light flickered to life on the display. The battery, somehow, still held charge. His heart thudded in his chest as he stared at it. The discovery unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. Cameras and recorders inside a sofa were not the kind of thing that happened in ordinary lives. He felt the urge to put them down, to walk away, to pretend he hadn't found them at all. But another part of him, the part that had always needed to understand how machines worked, urged him to dig deeper. He set the recorder aside and returned to the sofa, hands working faster now, tearing away fabric without the same patient care. By evening, the living room floor was covered in scraps of cloth, coils of stuffing, and small mounds of rusted tacks. The sofa sat gutted, its innards exposed, and Michael stood over it breathing heavily, sweat darkening his shirt. The two devices lay side by side on the table, mute reminders that this project was no longer just about upholstery. He glanced towards the darkening windows, half expecting to see someone watching from the street, but there was only the drizzle and the swaying of bare tree branches. He told himself there must be a logical explanation. Maybe his uncle had been paranoid and installed the devices himself, though that didn't explain their relatively modern design. Maybe the sofa had come from somewhere else, and his uncle hadn't known what was inside. But the fact that both devices still functioned, that the camera had blinked and the recorder had powered on, made him uneasy. They hadn't been forgotten relics. They had been placed with purpose. When night finally fell, Michael cleaned up the debris as best he could, though his hands trembled slightly as he gathered the fabric scraps. He stuffed them into trash bags and dragged them onto the porch, the rain soaking through the plastic almost immediately. Back inside, he locked the front door, then checked it twice before retreating to the kitchen. The old house had felt like a refuge when he arrived, but now it carried an unfamiliar weight, as though its silence concealed something more than memories. He ate dinner mechanically, barely tasting the sandwich he made, and every so often his eyes flicked to the table where the camera and recorder sat. The devices seemed to stare back at him. Their small lights burned into his memory. He thought about tossing them into the garbage, but something in him resisted. If they had been hidden deliberately, then they meant something. And if they meant something, then throwing them away might be a mistake. By the time he went upstairs to bed, Michael's mind was churning with questions he couldn't answer. He lay awake, listening to the rain hammering on the roof, wondering who had placed the devices when they had been hidden, and, most of all, why. The restoration of the sofa, meant to be a simple act of renewal, had opened a door he hadn't known existed. And though he tried to close his eyes and force himself to rest, he knew deep down that the house, the sofa, and his uncle's past were no longer just backdrops for his fresh start. They were mysteries demanding to be solved. And in the darkness, as the house settled around him with creaks and sighs, Michael realized with a cold certainty that restoring the sofa had been the easy part. What came next might be far more dangerous. Michael woke the next morning with a heaviness in his chest, as though the weight of the two devices downstairs had pressed on him all night long. He had tossed and turned, drifting between uneasy sleep and sharp awakenings, his dreams filled with blinking red lights and muffled voices hidden in the fabric of the sofa. When he finally sat up, the house was silent, except for the faint creak of timbers settling against the wind. He rubbed his face and tried to tell himself it was nothing, that he was overreacting, but the unease remained as steady as the pulse in his temples. Downstairs, the camera and recorder lay exactly where he had left them on the coffee table. Sunlight filtered weakly through the living room curtains, catching the faint shine on the plastic casing. He poured himself a cup of lukewarm coffee from the pot he had left on overnight and sat down in front of them. For a long time, he just looked at them, as though staring might force them to explain themselves. Eventually, curiosity pushed through the hesitation. He picked up the recorder, feeling its surprising weight in his hand. The casing was scratched, the buttons slightly sticky, but the faint glow of the display assured him it was still functional. He hesitated only a moment before pressing play. At first, there was nothing but a wash of static and faint hums, the kind of background noise that suggested silence more than sound. He leaned closer, straining to hear. Then came the scrape of a chair leg against wood, and a man's voice, muffled but clear enough to make his breath catch. "He's late again," the voice muttered. Another voice answered, lower and steadier. "Don't worry, he'll come through. He always does." Michael froze. These weren't random fragments of household life. They were conversations, deliberate and private, the kind of words exchanged between people who thought no one was listening. He pressed the button to skip forward, and another set of voices spilled out, this time sharper, almost angry. "If he doesn't pay up by Friday, we're done waiting." A pause, then the sound of something metallic striking wood. "He won't risk it. He knows what's at stake." Michael's stomach tightened. He clicked the button again, jumping through hours of recorded time. Most of it was empty. The creak of footsteps, the buzz of the television, the indistinct sounds of the house itself. But then came another voice he recognized faintly. It was his uncle's. Gruff, defensive, with that same gravelly timbre Michael remembered from childhood. "I told you, I don't have it right now. I just need more time." The reply was swift, edged with menace. "Time's run out, old man. You think we're joking? You think we don't know what you've been hiding?" Michael felt a cold sweat bead on the back of his neck. His uncle had always been private, a loner with no close friends, but never once had Michael suspected he might have been tangled up in something dangerous. He replayed the segment, listening carefully, hoping he had misunderstood, but the threat in the stranger's voice was undeniable. Whoever those men were, they hadn't been neighbors or casual acquaintances. They had been watching him, pressing him, demanding something he couldn't or wouldn't give. Michael set the recorder down with trembling hands. The discovery cut deeper than he had expected. His uncle hadn't simply been a reclusive man. He had been a man under surveillance, pressured by forces Michael had never known existed. He thought back to the camera hidden in the sofa. If it had still been recording when Michael found it, then whoever had placed it there might still be out there, waiting for more. Driven by a mix of fear and grim determination, he decided to check the files more thoroughly. He dug through an old drawer in the study until he found his uncle's dusty laptop. Its screen cracked in one corner but still functional when plugged in. He transferred the memory card from the recorder and opened the folders. Hundreds of audio files blinked back at him, each labeled with date and timestamps stretching back months. He clicked on one at random, this time from a few weeks before his uncle's death. The audio was faint, but the words were enough to turn his stomach. "We've got eyes on the place," one voice said. "He can't make a move without us knowing. The sofa's set. If he slips, we'll catch him." Then came a sound like laughter, sharp and humorless. Michael slammed the lid shut and sat back, heart hammering. The sofa hadn't been chosen by accident. It had been a tool, a carefully placed piece of surveillance, hidden in plain sight. Every hour his uncle had spent sitting there had been observed, recorded, analyzed by people who wanted something from him. The thought made Michael's skin crawl. He imagined his uncle sitting exactly where he sat now, never realizing that his words, his movements, his secrets were being captured by the very place he thought gave him rest. He paced the room, trying to calm the surge of anxiety. He didn't know who these men were or what they had wanted, but he understood now that his uncle's life had been far from simple. The man who had seemed so quiet, so withdrawn, had been living under pressure, perhaps even in fear. Michael wished he had known, wished he had asked more questions when the man was alive, but it was too late for that. All he had left were fragments, hidden in devices stuffed inside a piece of furniture. As the afternoon wore on, Michael returned to the sofa, compelled to search it further. He pulled away the remaining fabric, checking every corner, every seam, convinced there must be more hidden inside. And there was. Behind a wooden support beam in the lower frame, he found another small cavity. Inside it, wrapped in a plastic bag, was a stack of batteries and a tiny transmitter with its antenna bent at an angle. He held it up to the light, dread thick in his throat. This wasn't just some crude attempt at spying. It was professional, meticulous. Whoever had installed it had known what they were doing. He set the transmitter down beside the other devices, staring at the small collection with growing disbelief. The sofa wasn't just old furniture. It had been a hub of surveillance, a silent witness to conversations and dealings Michael could only begin to imagine. His mind returned again to the recordings, the threats, the mention of debts and hidden things. If his uncle had been caught up in something illegal, then Michael might have inherited more than just a house and a sofa. He might have inherited trouble. As dusk settled outside, the light in the living room turned amber, shadows stretching long across the floor. Michael sat in the dimness, surrounded by scraps of fabric and exposed springs, the gutted sofa looming like a carcass. The devices blinked faintly on the table, reminders that the past he thought he had left behind with his divorce had only led him to another kind of burden. He poured himself a glass of whiskey from the bottle he had unpacked the night before, his hand unsteady as he brought it to his lips. Every sound in the house seemed louder now. The groan of the floorboards, the rattle of branches against the window, even the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He felt exposed, watched, as though the act of discovering the devices had drawn invisible eyes toward him. He couldn't shake the thought that someone, somewhere, might already know he had found them. That night, when he finally went upstairs to bed, he double-checked every lock on the doors and windows. He pulled the curtains tight and set the recorder and camera inside a drawer, though he could still feel their presence like a weight pressing through the wood. Sleep came late, broken by shallow dreams of voices whispering in the dark, of his uncle's gravelly tone begging for more time, of faceless men sitting on the sofa where he now sat. When he awoke in the gray light of dawn, he knew with grim certainty that the restoration project he had started was no longer about fabric and wood. It was about uncovering the truth hidden inside the walls of his inheritance. And though he wasn't ready to admit it out loud, Michael knew that what he had found was only the beginning. The day after the discoveries inside the sofa passed in a haze that Michael could not quite describe. Every movement he made seemed tethered to the weight of what he had found, as if the camera, the recorder, and the transmitter on the coffee table had altered the air in the house itself. He could not stop glancing toward them, even when he tried to distract himself with other tasks. It felt as though they were alive somehow, pulsing with memory, carrying voices that refused to fade. The knowledge that his uncle had lived with these things around him, hidden in the fabric of the furniture he used every day, pressed heavily against Michael's thoughts. By evening, the rain that had been steady all day tapered off, leaving the house cloaked in silence broken only by the occasional patter of water dripping from the eaves. Michael fixed himself a simple dinner and ate it without tasting much. The loneliness of the house grew sharper, no longer softened by the optimism he had felt when he first arrived. Now the stillness felt like a presence of its own, filled with the possibility of footsteps on the stairs or a shadow moving in the hallway. He told himself he was imagining things, that he was letting fear guide him, but the unease would not let go. After he cleared his dishes and poured himself a second glass of whiskey, he found himself walking through the rooms with his flashlight, unable to resist the urge to check. He moved slowly from the kitchen to the dining room, the beam cutting through layers of dust and revealing the outlines of furniture that hadn't been touched in years. He tapped on the walls with his knuckles, listening for hollow spots. He checked under tables, behind curtains, even inside cupboards, his heart racing each time he found nothing. The more he searched, the more paranoid he felt, yet he couldn't stop himself. He remembered the voices on the recordings, the men talking about how his uncle couldn't make a move without being watched, and the words reverberated in his skull. Upstairs, he stood in his uncle's old bedroom and shone the light across the ceiling. The smoke detector there looked too new compared to the rest of the fixtures. It bothered him. He dragged a chair over, climbed up, and twisted the detector off its mount. For a moment, his breath caught, certain he would find another camera inside, another red light blinking. But the plastic casing contained nothing more than a regular sensor, dusty and ordinary. He almost laughed with relief, then cursed himself for the way his nerves jumped at every suspicion. When he returned downstairs, the house seemed to mock him with its quiet. He sat in the living room, staring at the gutted sofa, its innards spilling out onto the floor like entrails from some disemboweled creature. He couldn't bring himself to keep working on it. The idea of restoration, of giving it new life, felt absurd now. What it had given him was not renewal, but a creeping fear, a realization that his uncle's world had been darker than he had ever guessed. The whiskey warmed his throat, but did nothing for the tension coiled in his stomach. He picked up the recorder again and played another random file, almost against his will. The sound of his uncle's voice filled the room once more, weary and pleading. "I can't keep doing this," the old man said. Then came silence, broken by a stranger's reply, "You don't have a choice." Michael shut it off quickly, his hand trembling. The words left an echo that seemed to seep into the walls. He leaned back in the chair and pressed his palms to his eyes, telling himself he should stop, that he was only feeding the anxiety. But the knowledge of those voices was inside him now, as real as the floor under his feet. He had inherited not just a house, but a burden, one that demanded attention. When midnight came, Michael lay in bed, fully clothed, the lamp still on. Every sound the house made jolted him awake. The rustle of branches outside became footsteps. The settling of the roof became the shift of weight on the stairs. He lay still, listening, his pulse quickening with every creak. The walls of the room felt too close, the air too heavy. He imagined men slipping silently through the door, men like the ones on the recordings, their voices low and cold. At one point, he thought he heard a soft tap at the back of the house, as if something brushed against the screen door. He held his breath and stared at the ceiling, straining to listen. When the noise didn't repeat, he told himself it had been nothing more than the wind. Still, he climbed out of bed and checked the locks again, his fingers fumbling on the deadbolts. He stood in the hallway for a long time, listening to the silence before finally returning upstairs. The minutes stretched into hours, the clock ticking on the nightstand with relentless clarity. His mind returned again and again to the possibility that more devices were hidden somewhere, perhaps in the vents, behind the photo frames, beneath the shelves. He pictured invisible red lights blinking in the dark, recording his every move. The thought made his skin crawl. He told himself he would search again in the morning, thoroughly, room by room, until he could be certain. As dawn began to bleed pale light through the curtains, he finally drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. His dreams were filled with distorted images. His uncle sitting on the sofa with a shadowy figure beside him, men's voices whispering through walls, cameras blinking from every corner. He woke with a start, his body heavy and exhausted, his mind buzzing with the knowledge that the devices in the sofa were only the beginning. The house no longer felt like a safe inheritance. It felt like a cage that had belonged to someone else long before him, a cage wired with secrets. And, as Michael sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, he understood that pretending otherwise would no longer be possible. He had stumbled into a story larger than himself, and the night's restless hours had only confirmed it. There was no turning back. Michael awoke the following morning with the exhaustion of a man who had not truly slept. His body felt heavy, his thoughts clouded, and his first instinct was to check the locks on the doors again before even making coffee. The house, once a place he had hoped would bring him peace, now felt like a hostile witness, every creak and shadow reminding him of the night before. He walked slowly down the stairs, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight, and paused in the living room where the gutted sofa remained a broken carcass in the middle of the floor. On the coffee table beside it, the camera, the recorder, and the transmitter lay in silence, but they pulled at his gaze as though they might spring back to life at any moment. The light of day brought no comfort. Instead, it sharpened the edges of his fear. Michael poured himself a cup of coffee, though he barely drank it, the taste bitter and metallic on his tongue. His thoughts circled around the recordings he had only skimmed the night before. He knew there was more stored inside that small, unremarkable device than he had dared to hear. There were answers hidden in those files, fragments of his uncle's life that might explain the fear and secrecy, and perhaps even the strange solitude that had defined the old man's final years. The idea unsettled him, but the need to know was stronger. He powered on his uncle's battered laptop again, its fan humming with effort, and connected the recorder. The folders loaded slowly, and he opened the one containing the most recent dates. Hundreds of files stretched across the screen, each time-stamped, each waiting like a closed door. He clicked on the most recent recording and leaned closer, his heart racing. The sound began faint, a low hum of the room, then the shuffle of footsteps. Michael recognized his uncle's voice almost immediately. It was weaker than he remembered, a raspier version of the man who had once barked commands over a backyard barbecue. "I told you, I can't keep this up," the uncle said. His words carried a mix of defiance and exhaustion. Then another voice cut in, sharp and unyielding. "You don't get to decide when this ends. You owe us, and you'll keep paying until we say otherwise." Michael's hands clenched into fists on the table. He stopped the playback, his pulse hammering. The words painted a clearer picture than he wanted to see. His uncle had been under pressure, maybe even blackmailed. These men, whoever they were, had been inside the house, sitting on the very sofa where Michael now sat, using it as a stage for their threats. He pressed play again. This time, the recording captured laughter, cold and humorless. "If you think you can hide it, you're wrong. We'll find it. The sofa isn't the only thing watching you." The sentence sent a chill crawling down Michael's spine. He glanced around the room instinctively, as though the walls themselves might be listening. He paused the recording, his throat dry, and sat back. When he gathered the courage to continue, he jumped forward through several more files, each one carrying pieces of conversations. Some were mundane. His uncle watching television, coughing, the rattle of dishes in the kitchen, but others carried the same sinister tone. "Friday," one voice said. "If it's not here by Friday, we'll take what we need ourselves." Another file contained his uncle muttering to himself, pacing the floor, cursing under his breath about money and them never leaving me alone. The pieces formed a picture that made Michael uneasy. His uncle had not been simply a quiet old man living alone. He had been a man under constant surveillance, monitored by people who had the power to invade his home, his privacy, his peace. The sofa had been their tool, their window into his life. And now it was Michael's burden. After hours of listening, Michael came across a recording that shook him more deeply than the others. It began with the sound of a door opening, then slow footsteps crossing the living room. A chair scraped. One of the men spoke. "It's all set. He won't know until it's too late." Another answered, "Good. When he cracks, we'll be ready." There was the scrape of a pen across paper, and then silence. Michael leaned closer to the laptop screen, his chest tight. The timestamp was only a few months before his uncle's death. He sat frozen for a long time, the voices echoing in his head. His uncle's death had been reported as natural, a heart attack that struck him one evening. But now, Michael wondered if fear and pressure had played a role, if the relentless monitoring had broken him down piece by piece until his body finally gave out. The thought filled him with a cold anger, a sense of injustice that burned in his chest. Needing to move, he shut the laptop and paced the room, running his hands through his hair. The gutted sofa loomed like an open wound, its springs jutting out, fabric dangling in strips. He felt as if it mocked him now, no longer a project of restoration, but a relic of entrapment. He kicked at one of the cushions, sending dust into the air, and turned away. His eyes landed on the small window facing the backyard. The glass reflected his own face back at him, but for a brief moment he imagined he saw someone else's figure moving outside. He spun towards the door, his heart hammering, but the yard was empty, still wet from the previous night's rain. The paranoia gnawed at him. He could not tell any more if his imagination was running wild or if there was real danger pressing against the edges of his life. The recordings made one thing clear. His uncle had been trapped, monitored, and threatened. There was no guarantee the surveillance had ended with his death. Michael wondered if the people behind it knew that the house now belonged to him, and, if they did, whether they cared. By late afternoon, the shadows in the room grew longer, stretching across the floor like fingers. Michael returned to the laptop and clicked through more files, this time finding recordings that made his pulse quicken. They contained references to places outside the house, fragments of conversations about a suitcase, and the shed out back. One voice said, "He thinks we don't know about the shed. He's wrong. When the time comes, we'll tear it apart." Michael froze at the words. The shed stood in the back of the property, half collapsed, something he had barely noticed since moving in. Now it pulsed in his mind like a beacon. He shut the laptop again, unable to continue. The house felt too small, the air too thick. He went outside into the evening light, breathing deeply, the cool air clearing his head. The shed sat at the far edge of the yard, its roof sagging, its door hanging loosely on its hinges. He stared at it from the porch, but didn't move closer. Not yet. He wasn't ready. The knowledge of what he might find inside weighed too heavily. When darkness fell, he locked the doors again, pulled the curtains shut, and sat in the living room with the whiskey bottle near at hand. The recordings had revealed more than he had bargained for, and he could not shake the feeling that his uncle's troubles had not died with him. As he sipped, staring at the broken sofa, he realized the restoration project had been replaced by something far darker. An investigation he hadn't chosen but could no longer ignore. The night dragged on, heavy with silence, each tick of the clock reminding him that morning would bring new choices. He had evidence now, voices, threats, timestamps, that painted a clear picture of what his uncle had endured. But the evidence also tied the house and, by extension himself, to people he didn't understand and didn't trust. His uncle had lived under their gaze, and Michael had stumbled into the same snare. When he finally went upstairs, the weight of it all pressed down on him. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the house, every creak magnified in the stillness. He thought about the shed, about the suitcase mentioned in the recordings, about the possibility that even now someone might be watching. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was fractured by images of strangers' voices in his ear, of his uncle's desperate pleas, and of red lights blinking steadily in the dark. Morning would demand action. He knew it even before he closed his eyes. He couldn't go on pretending he was only a restorer of old furniture. He had crossed a line, and what he had found meant he would have to choose between silence and the truth. The morning arrived gray and cool, the air heavy with the smell of damp earth after the long night of rain. Michael rose early, though he had not slept more than a few restless hours. His body ached with fatigue, but his mind was sharper than it had been in days. He could no longer convince himself that the discoveries inside the sofa, the recordings on the devices, and the voices of strangers demanding money from his uncle were things he could handle alone. The weight of it had grown too heavy, and the longer he carried it, the more certain he became that he was in over his head. He brewed a pot of coffee, drank it quickly, and looked at the table where the camera, recorder, and transmitter still sat in silence. For 2 days he had kept them like trophies or relics, unable to part with them as if they held a key to understanding his uncle's life. But now he realized they were more than relics. They were evidence. Every word spoken on those recordings was proof that his uncle had been watched, threatened, and harassed. The longer Michael kept them to himself, the more he risked becoming part of a secret he never wanted. The decision settled in him like a stone. He would go to the police. He gathered the devices carefully, wrapping them in a towel and placing them into an old shoebox he found in the closet. He slipped the box into a duffel bag and set it by the door. For a moment, he hesitated, his hand resting on the strap. Doubts crept in. What if the police didn't believe him? What if they laughed off his story about hidden cameras in a sofa? Or worse, what if they believed him and dragged him into a larger investigation, one that would expose him to people far more dangerous than he could handle? He pushed the doubts away. His uncle had lived under surveillance until the day he died, and Michael had stumbled into the middle of it. Pretending otherwise was no longer an option. He had heard the voices, the threats, the promises of violence. Whoever those men were, they had left fingerprints of their presence, and the police had to see them. The drive to the sheriff's office took only 15 minutes, but it felt longer. The small-town streets were quiet at that hour, shopkeepers just beginning to lift shutters and sweep sidewalks. Michael parked his truck outside the brick building and sat for a moment gripping the steering wheel. He told himself he could still turn back, still carry the burden himself. But then he thought of his uncle's voice on the recorder, cracked with fear as he pleaded for more time, and the decision hardened again. He picked up the duffel bag, stepped out into the chill air, and walked inside. The sheriff's office smelled faintly of coffee and paper, the walls lined with bulletin boards covered in notices and photographs. A deputy behind the counter looked up as Michael approached, his expression professional but curious. Michael asked to speak with someone about a matter he believed was important, something connected to his uncle's death. The deputy raised an eyebrow but didn't dismiss him. Instead, he picked up the phone and made a brief call before asking Michael to take a seat. Minutes later, a tall man in plain clothes appeared, his badge clipped to his belt. He introduced himself as Detective Harris. His handshake was firm, his eyes sharp, carrying the calm authority of someone used to sorting truth from lies. Michael followed him into a small office where blinds filtered the sunlight into pale stripes across the desk. Harris gestured for him to sit. "So, you said this has to do with your uncle?" Michael explained carefully, beginning with his inheritance of the house, then the sofa he had decided to restore, and finally the discoveries inside. He spoke slowly at first, worried how it would sound, but as he described finding the camera, the recorder, and the transmitter, the detective's expression grew more serious. When Michael reached into the duffel bag and placed the shoebox on the desk, Harris leaned forward, his hands still. "Let me see those," he said. Michael opened the box and laid out the devices. Harris studied each one, turning them over with practiced hands. His jaw tightened as he recognized the camera's design, the recorder's durability, and the transmitter's sophistication. He looked up at Michael. And you're sure those came from inside the sofa? I tore it apart myself, Michael replied. They were hidden inside the frame behind the fabric. The recorder still works. I listened to some of the files. They're not just background noise. They're conversations, threats, people talking to my uncle. The detective sat back, his gaze fixed on Michael. Did you bring the files? Michael nodded and handed him the flash drive he had loaded that morning with copies of the most damning recordings. Harris plugged it into his computer and pressed play. For several minutes, the room filled with the same voices Michael had heard in his living room. The men pressing his uncle for money, laughing about the surveillance, warning him about time running out. Harris listened without speaking, his face unreadable. But when the audio ended, he leaned back and crossed his arms. "This is serious," he said at last. "Very serious. I don't know if you realize exactly what you've stumbled into, but you did the right thing coming here." Michael felt both relief and fear at the words. "So, you believe me?" "I believe your uncle was being watched," Harris said. "And I believe whoever put those devices in that sofa wasn't just curious. They had a reason, and it wasn't innocent." He paused, studying Michael's tired face. "Did you find anything else in the house? Anything unusual?" Michael hesitated. He thought about the shed in the backyard, the one mentioned in the recordings. He hadn't yet mustered the courage to go inside. For a moment, he considered keeping it to himself, but then he thought of his uncle again and forced the words out. "There's a shed. They talked about it on the recordings. I haven't checked it yet." Harris scribbled a note on his pad. "We'll want to look at that. For now, I'll have our tech team analyze these devices, trace where they came from, maybe pull more from the recordings than you could on your own." He closed the lid of the box firmly, as though sealing away its menace. "You said you just moved into the house?" Michael nodded. "Then listen to me carefully. Until we know more, keep your doors locked, stay alert, and don't go digging around on your own. If these people are still active, you don't want to draw their attention. Let us handle it." Michael swallowed hard and agreed. Relief washed over him in one sense. The burden was no longer his alone, but fear lingered just beneath it. The detective's words made it clear this wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Later that day, Michael returned to the house. The silence inside felt different now, less suffocating, though the knowledge that the police were now involved carried its own weight. He sat in the living room, staring at the gutted sofa, and thought about how quickly things had changed. What had begun as an act of restoration had turned into a doorway into his uncle's hidden life, and now it had drawn the attention of law enforcement. That evening, Harris called to confirm that the equipment was legitimate surveillance gear, the kind not sold in local stores, but through channels often linked to organized groups. They would be conducting a search of the shed the following day. As Michael hung up the phone, he felt both dread and hope. Perhaps soon he would know the truth, or at least part of it, but the truth might come with a price. He locked the doors again that night, checked the windows, and sat by the lamp in the living room with a blanket draped over his shoulders. For the first time in days, he felt a measure of protection, knowing he wasn't entirely alone in facing this. Yet, as he drifted off in the chair, he couldn't escape the thought that someone, somewhere, might still be watching, waiting for the chance to take back what Michael had uncovered. The morning came crisp and pale, the kind of autumn day when the air felt sharp in the lungs. Michael stood at the kitchen window with a mug of coffee cooling in his hands, staring across the yard at the shed. The detective and his team had been there the afternoon before, combing through its dark corners and collapsing shelves, searching for whatever secrets his uncle had hidden away. Michael hadn't been allowed too close, but he had watched from the porch as they carried out boxes and bags, their expressions grim. When it was done, Harris had assured him the investigation would continue, that there was enough evidence to connect the surveillance equipment and the voices on the recordings to a wider network. For Michael, that was enough. He didn't need every detail, not now. He needed only to know that the danger didn't sit solely on his shoulders anymore. Still, the house felt different, its silence less oppressive now that it was no longer just his burden to carry. He walked slowly through the rooms, each step echoing across the worn floorboards, and tried to imagine what his uncle must have felt living here under watchful eyes. The thought filled him with sorrow, but also with a strange resolve. His uncle had been trapped, but Michael would not let himself fall into the same shadow. This house was his now, and he would shape it into something else, something free of the weight of hidden cameras and whispered threats. That afternoon, he called a locksmith to replace every lock on the doors and windows. He watched the man work with methodical precision, fitting new deadbolts and sliding latches into place. Later, he ordered motion lights for the yard and scheduled the installation of a modest security system. It wasn't paranoia now, it was prudence. If his uncle had taught him anything, it was that safety could be stolen in silence, piece by piece, until nothing remained. Michael wouldn't make that mistake. The sofa still sat gutted in the living room, its frame exposed, fabric hanging in shreds. For days, he had considered finishing the restoration, but the thought of it filled him with unease. It no longer symbolized renewal. It had become a monument to what his uncle had endured. One evening, as dusk fell across the neighborhood, he dragged it out the front door, the legs scraping across the porch steps, and left it at the curb. Standing over it, he felt a rush of finality. He wouldn't rebuild something that had been used as a prison. Instead, he would start fresh. The next week, he went into town and bought a new sofa, simple and sturdy with clean lines and a fabric that smelled faintly of the store's warehouse. When it arrived, he placed it in the same spot beneath the living room window where the old one had stood. As he sat on it for the first time, he felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The room looked brighter somehow, the air lighter. Yet he knew he would never forget what the other sofa had hidden, nor the truths it had forced into the light. Days passed, and life began to settle into a rhythm. The police updated him occasionally, telling him the devices were connected to a group known for extortion and illegal surveillance. His uncle, it seemed, had been one of their many victims. They couldn't say for certain whether his death had been natural or the result of relentless stress, but they assured Michael that those responsible were being watched now in turn. Hearing it didn't erase the unease, but it gave him something to hold on to, the sense that justice, however incomplete, was moving forward. The neighbors began to take notice of Michael's presence. At first, they had regarded him with curiosity, some with suspicion, but soon they warmed. They brought over casseroles and pies, introduced themselves, and shared quiet stories about his uncle. Most had thought him eccentric, even unfriendly, but a few admitted they had seen signs of his fear: lights on at odd hours, curtains always drawn, a man who walked the yard as though expecting someone to be there. Their words confirmed what Michael had already pieced together from the recordings, but hearing it from their mouths deepened his sympathy. His uncle hadn't just been private, he had been cornered. In time, the house began to transform. Michael painted the front porch, repaired the railing, and replaced the squealing screen door. He cleaned out the upstairs rooms, patched the holes in the drywall, and sanded the scuffed floors until they gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Each task, no matter how small, felt like an act of reclamation, a way of asserting that the house would no longer belong to fear. It belonged to him, to his future, to whatever memories he could build within its walls. At night, the unease still lingered. He checked the locks more than once before bed, paused at the windows to scan the yard, and sometimes startled awake at the sound of branches against the siding. But those moments lessened with time, replaced gradually by a steadier calm. He knew fear would not vanish overnight. It lingered like a shadow after sunset, fading slowly. What mattered was that it no longer ruled him. He was the one shaping his days now, not the echoes of the past. One evening, weeks after the police had taken the devices away, Michael sat on his new sofa with a book in his lap. The lamp cast a warm glow across the room, highlighting the fresh paint on the walls and the clean lines of the furniture. Outside, the yard lights he had installed burned brightly, pushing the darkness back. For the first time since moving in, he felt at home. He thought of his children, of how he might invite them to stay for weekends, of how laughter might fill these rooms again. The house that had once seemed a burden now held the promise of something better. Yet he knew he would never look at an ordinary object the same way again. A sofa was no longer just a sofa. A smoke detector was not simply a fixture. Every mundane detail carried the possibility of secrets hidden within it. He accepted that this was the price of what he had uncovered, the scar left behind by truth. Perhaps it was not such a bad thing. A little caution, a little vigilance, these could protect him in ways his uncle had never managed. As evening deepened, Michael closed his book and leaned back. He thought about the path that had led him here, a divorce that had stripped him of his old life, an inheritance that had seemed like nothing more than a crumbling house, and a sofa that had forced him to see the darkness that can hide in plain sight. He felt older, perhaps, more weathered than before, but he also felt steadier, stronger. He had faced something that could have broken him, and though fear had walked beside him, it had not taken him down. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights cutting briefly across the living room window before disappearing. Michael watched the glow fade and listened to the silence that followed. It no longer felt like a hostile silence. It was simply quiet, the kind of quiet he could live with. He pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders and allowed himself a small, tired smile. The house had given him its secrets, and now it was ready to give him peace. He would carry the lessons it had forced upon him, the awareness that safety is fragile and trust must be guarded. But he would not let those lessons chain him. The sofa was gone, the devices gone, the shadows of his uncle's troubles receding into the past. What remained was a man and a home and the chance to begin again. And, for the first time since stepping into the house, Michael believed that was possible. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. We have even more unbelievable stories waiting for you. Click right here to watch the next video, or dive into our other shocking uploads that will leave you speechless. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. You never know who needs to hear a story like this today.